There is a moment, if you pay close enough attention, when you begin to notice a pattern. You look at two people who started in roughly the same place, same city, similar education, comparable income, maybe even the same neighborhood, and yet, 10 or 15 years down the road, their financial lives look almost nothing alike. One of them has built something, a cushion, a foundation, perhaps investments, savings, a business, or simply the quiet, unshakable sense of financial stability. The other is still running in place, still reacting to money rather than directing it, still wondering where it all went at the end of every month. This observation is not meant to judge anyone. Life is complicated, and circumstances are rarely identical, no matter how similar they appear on the surface. But the pattern is real enough, and it appears consistently enough that it demands a serious question. What is actually different between these two people? What is the variable that keeps showing up again and again in the lives of those who steadily build wealth? And what is missing in the lives of those who do not? For a long time, the popular answer was simple. It was income. If you earned more, you built more. But that explanation falls apart quickly when you start looking closely. There are people earning very high salaries who have almost nothing saved. There are people with modest incomes who retire comfortably and leave something meaningful behind for the people they love. Income matters, of course, but income alone does not explain the difference. Something else is at work. Others have pointed to luck. Being born into the right family, knowing the right people, stumbling into the right opportunity at the right time, and certainly luck plays a role in human life. No honest thinker would deny that. But luck cannot be the primary explanation either, because the patterns of wealth building behavior tend to persist across luck. The same habits, the same choices, the same mental orientations appear in people who built wealth from nothing, and in people who were handed an early advantage. Conversely, the same patterns of financial self-sabotage appear regardless of how much luck someone received at the start. Lottery winners go broke. Trust fund recipients exhaust inheritances. Meanwhile, immigrants who arrive with almost nothing build lasting financial security within a generation. So if it is not purely income and not purely luck, what is it? What is the consistent variable? The answer that emerges from psychology, from behavioral economics, from decades of observational research, and frankly from simply watching how people think and behave around money, is this: it is mindset. It is the mental framework through which someone understands money, time, opportunity, and value. It is the internal conversation a person has about what money is for, where it comes from, and how it should be treated. Wealth, in most cases, does not begin in a bank account. It begins in a way of thinking, and that is both a humbling insight and a deeply hopeful one. Because while you cannot always control your income, and you certainly cannot control luck, you can, with effort, with awareness, and with practice, begin to change the way you think. This is not a program about get-rich-quick strategies. There are no secret shortcuts hidden in these pages. No investment system that the financial establishment supposedly does not want you to know about. None of that. What you will find here is something far more durable and far more useful. A deep look at the psychology of wealth building, the mental habits, the thinking patterns, the emotional disciplines, and the long-term orientations that show up again and again in the lives of people who build real, lasting financial stability. This is about rewiring how you see money. Not to become obsessed with it, but to stop being confused by it, to stop being controlled by it, to start relating to it with the kind of calm, strategic intelligence that turns ordinary income, over time, into something genuinely meaningful. The principles we will explore are not flashy. They do not promise instant transformation, but they are powerful, and they are real. Because wealth, when it is built well, is almost always built slowly, quietly, through patterns of thinking and behavior that compound in the background of a life, year after year, until one day you look up and realize that you are standing on solid ground. That is the kind of wealth this is about, and it begins right here in how you think. So let us begin. The first principle that separates people who build wealth from people who do not is one of the most studied and consistently validated concepts in all of behavioral psychology. It is the capacity for long-term thinking. And while that phrase may sound simple, almost obvious, the reality of living it, of genuinely orienting your daily decisions around a future that is years or even decades away, is one of the most demanding psychological feats a human being can attempt. We are not naturally built for long-term thinking. This is not a character flaw, it is biology. Our brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in an environment where survival was immediate and constant. The threats were present tense. The food was either here or it was not. The danger was now. And so our nervous systems developed a deeply wired bias toward the immediate. We feel today's pain more sharply than tomorrow's. We value a reward we can have right now far more than a larger reward we must wait for. We respond to visible, tangible, present, tense reality with much greater urgency than we respond to abstract future projections. This is why the smell of fresh food is hard to resist when you are trying to stick to a budget. This is why buying something you do not need feels better in the moment than the quiet knowledge that you are adding to your financial security. This is why we procrastinate on financial planning even when we know, intellectually, that it is important. Our minds are tilted, by design, toward now, and the financial world is designed to exploit that tilt. Every advertisement, every sale, every easy credit offer, every buy now, pay later button, all of it is engineered to activate your present, moment reward circuitry, to make the now feel urgent and the future feel distant and abstract. The people profiting from your spending are not neutral bystanders. They are actively working to shorten your time horizon, to get you focused on the next 30 seconds rather than the next 30 years. People who build wealth, genuinely build it, steadily over time, have learned to push back against this current, not perfectly, not without struggle, but consistently enough, and over a long enough period of time that the cumulative effect becomes enormous. Walter Mischel's famous marshmallow experiments at Stanford gave the world a memorable image of this principle in action. Children were placed in a room with a single marshmallow and told they could eat it now or wait a short time and receive 2 marshmallows. Some children ate immediately, others waited. The striking finding came years later, when researchers followed up with those same children as adults, the ones who had been able to wait, who had demonstrated that early capacity for delayed gratification, tended to score higher on a remarkable range of life outcomes: academic performance, financial stability, health, and even relationship satisfaction. Now, the research around those specific experiments has grown more nuanced over the decades. Socioeconomic background, trust in institutions, and other environmental factors clearly play a role in whether a child waits or does not. but the core insight holds: the capacity to delay gratification. To choose a better future outcome over a more immediate, lesser one is one of the most powerful variables in a financially successful life. And here is the critical point, that capacity is not fixed. It is not something you either have or you do not. It is a skill, a psychological muscle, and like every muscle, it can be trained. Long-term thinking, in the context of wealth building, shows up in dozens of small, seemingly unremarkable decisions. It is the decision to put money into a retirement account this month, instead of spending it on something you want, but do not need. It is the decision to spend 10 hours learning a skill that will not pay off for another 2 years. It is the decision to buy a modest car, instead of a car that would impress your neighbors, because you understand, on a gut level, that the difference invested over a decade compounds into something far more valuable than admiration. It also shows up in how you interpret time itself. People who build wealth tend to have a deeply felt understanding that time is not neutral. Time is a multiplier. The same dollar invested today is worth dramatically more than the same dollar invested 5 years from now, not because of magic, but because of the mathematics of compounding. Every year of delay is not just a year missed, it is a year of growth forfeited. And those years, stacked up, make an almost incomprehensible difference. Consider someone who begins setting aside a modest sum each month at the age of 25. By the time they reach 65, assuming average market returns, that sum has had 40 years to compound. Now consider someone who waits until age 35 to begin, just 10 years later. That 10-year delay does not reduce their outcome by 10 years' worth of savings. It reduces it by something far larger, because those first 10 years were also doing the work of compounding everything that came after. The difference in outcome between these two imaginary people is not proportional to the delay. It is exponential. This is what long-term thinkers understand at a level that goes beyond intellectual knowledge. They feel it. They have internalized the truth that every year matters, every decision compounds, and the future is not a distant abstraction. It is a very real destination that is being shaped right now by the choices being made today. There is another dimension of long-term thinking that is worth exploring carefully, and it has to do with goals. Short-term thinkers tend to organize their financial behavior around what they want right now. The next purchase, the next experience, the next status signal. Long-term thinkers organize their behavior around visions of what they want their life to look like in 10, 20, 30 years. They have thought about that future in enough detail that it becomes emotionally real enough to compete with the pull of present, tense desire. This is not wishful thinking. It is strategic imagination, the ability to mentally inhabit your future self, to feel what it would mean to have financial security, financial freedom, the ability to make choices based on values rather than necessity, and to use that emotional connection to your future as a counterweight against the impulses of the present. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as future self continuity. People with a strong sense of connection to their future selves are more likely to make sacrifices for that future person's benefit. They save more. They invest more. They take better care of their health and their minds because they genuinely feel that their future self is them, not some abstract stranger who will inherit the consequences of today's choices, but a real continuation of who they are. One powerful practice for developing this kind of long-term thinking is simply writing. Sit with a blank page, physical or digital, and write about where you want to be financially in 5 years, in 10, in 20. Write in enough detail that it becomes vivid. What does your life look like? What choices does it allow you to make? What pressures are absent from that life that are present in your life today? The more vividly and specifically you can imagine that future, the more emotionally compelling it becomes. And the more emotionally compelling it becomes, the more naturally your day-to-day decisions begin to orient toward it. Long-term thinking is ultimately a form of respect. Respect for your future self. Respect for the reality that today's small choices are tomorrow's large outcomes. And that shift in respect, that reorientation of where you place your emotional energy and your decision-making focus, is one of the most powerful financial moves you will ever make. The second principle takes us into territory that might surprise some people who think about wealth primarily in terms of savings and investment strategies. It is this wealth, in the deepest and most sustainable sense, tends to follow the creation of value, not the accumulation of money, but the generation of something genuinely useful, something that solves a real problem, meets a real need, or makes someone's life meaningfully better. This principle has a philosophical dimension that is easy to miss. We live in a culture that often frames financial success as a kind of extraction, getting more than your share, winning while others lose, accumulating resources at the expense of the broader world. And while that framing is not entirely without basis, it describes a narrow and ultimately fragile form of financial gain. The more durable, more ethical, and frankly more accessible form of wealth building is rooted in something quite different: contribution. Think about the businesses and individuals who have built the most lasting wealth across human history. What is the common thread? Almost invariably, it is that they found a way to create something valuable, something that other people wanted, needed, or were willing to pay for. The farmer who grew more food than anyone else in the valley. The craftsman whose tools lasted longer than his competitors. The merchant who connected supply with demand more efficiently than anyone had before. The engineer who figured out how to make a product 10 times cheaper without sacrificing quality. The writer whose work clarified something that millions of people felt but could not express. Value creation takes many forms, but its core logic is always the same. You find a gap, a problem unsolved, a need unmet, a process inefficient, and you apply your energy, your creativity, your knowledge, or your labor to closing that gap. And the market, which is ultimately just the aggregate of human wants and needs, rewards that act of closing the gap with money. This has an important psychological implication. When you orient your financial thinking around value creation, rather than money accumulation, you stop asking, "How can I get more money?" and start asking, "How can I create more value?" And those are very different questions. The first is a dead end. Money, pursued directly, tends to either elude you or, when you catch it, leave you feeling strangely empty. But value, the act of genuinely helping, genuinely solving, genuinely contributing, is something you can always find more of to do. The opportunities are unlimited because human problems are unlimited. This reorientation also has a compounding effect on your skills and reputation. Every time you create genuine value for someone, whether it is an employer, a customer, a client, or a community, you are building something that money cannot buy directly, but that reliably generates money over time. You are building a reputation for excellence. You are deepening a skill set that makes you more valuable in the future. You are expanding a network of people who trust your work and are inclined to send more opportunities your direction. Each act of value creation seeds the ground for the next one. The psychological trap that many people fall into here is thinking about value creation only in terms of their job, their income, the narrow channel through which money currently flows to them. But value creation is a much broader category of activity than employment. It includes the book you might write, the small business you might start, the skill you might develop and teach to others, the community you might organize around a shared problem, the investment of time and attention that turns an underutilized asset into a productive one. Every person reading this has the capacity to create value in ways that go beyond their current income stream. The question is whether they are thinking creatively and expansively about what they have to offer, what problems they are positioned to solve, what knowledge they carry that others need, what connections they can make between people who would benefit from knowing each other. There is a mental shift required here that deserves to be named clearly, moving from a scarcity orientation to an abundance orientation. People who are locked in a scarcity mindset tend to think about money in terms of fixed resources being divided among competing claimants. If someone else gets more, there is less for me. This is a zero-sum view of wealth, and while it is not without any basis in reality, it is an enormously limiting way to navigate economic life. Because it is fundamentally passive, it frames you as a competitor for existing resources rather than a creator of new ones. People who build wealth through value creation have internalized a different model. The economic pie is not fixed. Value can be created from nothing, from a good idea, from a skilled pair of hands, from a solution that did not exist yesterday. And when new value is created, it expands the total amount of wealth available in the world. This is not naive optimism. It is the literal mechanism of economic growth across human history. The practical implication is that you should be consistently asking yourself, not just when you are thinking about money, but as a general orientation in life, what problems exist in my world that I am positioned to help solve? What needs are unmet that my skills, knowledge, or resources could address? What value could I be creating that I am not currently creating? These questions, asked seriously and answered honestly, are among the most financially productive things you can do. Because value creation, more than any savings strategy or investment technique, is the primary engine of sustainable wealth. Allow yourself now to imagine a person. Her name is Miriam. She grew up in a working-class household in a mid-sized city, the daughter of a factory worker and a school cafeteria supervisor. Money was not discussed openly in her home, but its scarcity was felt constantly. In the careful way her mother reviewed receipts at the grocery store, in the quiet tension that descended when the car needed an unexpected repair, in the sense absorbed almost unconsciously over years of childhood, that money was something that happened to you, rather than something you directed. Miriam graduated from high school without much financial knowledge and without a clear vision of what financial stability even looked like from the inside. She got a job, she paid her bills. She occasionally had a little left over and occasionally did not. She was, in the language of personal finance, surviving, which is not nothing, but it is very different from building. The shift for Miriam did not come from a windfall. It did not come from a promotion or a sudden inheritance. It came from a book, a library book, actually, one she picked up almost by accident on a slow Tuesday afternoon when she was 26 years old and mildly restless. The book was about the psychology of money, not investment strategies, not stock picking, just the way people think about money, the way emotions shape financial decisions, the way small habits compound over time into dramatically different outcomes. She read that book in 3 days. Then she read it again, more slowly, with a notebook beside her, and something began to shift. Not in her bank account, not yet, but in her mental relationship with money. For the first time, she began to understand that her financial situation was not just the result of her income. It was the result of 1,000 small, mostly unconscious choices being made every day through a mental framework she had inherited rather than chosen. The first thing Miriam did was embarrassingly simple. She started writing down every single thing she spent money on for 30 days. Every cup of coffee, every small online purchase, every subscription, every spontaneous snack from the vending machine at work. She did not change anything yet. She just looked, and what she saw startled her. Not because she was spending wildly, she was not, but because there was a pattern she had never noticed before. She was spending money, consistently and reliably, in ways that brought her almost no lasting satisfaction. Small purchases made on impulse or out of habit or mild boredom. That disappeared from her memory almost as quickly as they disappeared from her wallet. Money evaporating not into joy, but into inertia. That observation was the beginning of Miriam's financial education, and it is worth pausing here to understand why it was so powerful. It was powerful because it was based on reality. Her reality, not someone else's theory about money. She was not reading about what some hypothetical average person did wrong. She was reading her own data, seeing her own patterns, confronting her own habits with unfiltered clarity. Clarity, it turns out, is one of the most underrated tools in personal finance. Most people navigate their financial lives in a kind of low-grade fog. They know roughly how much they earn and roughly how much they spend. But they rarely look with precision and honesty at the gap between where they are and where they want to be, or at the specific behaviors that are keeping that gap in place. Miriam now had clarity, and clarity, uncomfortable as it can be, is the foundation of change. Over the following months, she made one small change at a time. First, she identified the spending patterns that gave her essentially nothing in return and began replacing them, not with deprivation, but with intention. Instead of 20 small impulsive purchases a month, she gave herself a deliberate small pleasure budget, a specific amount set aside in advance, designated for whatever brought her genuine enjoyment. Everything else was redirected where? At first into an emergency fund. She had read enough to know that financial precarity is self-reinforcing, that when you have no buffer, every unexpected expense becomes a crisis, and crises breed poor decisions made under stress. Building that buffer was not glamorous. It took 8 months. But when she had it, 3 months of expenses sitting in a savings account, untouched. Just there, she noticed that something changed in how she felt about her life. Not rich, not transformed, but less anxious, less brittle. Like she was standing on slightly more stable ground. Then she turned her attention to debt. She had a modest amount of it, a credit card balance that had been hovering for 2 years, accumulating interest that she had barely registered as a cost because she never looked at it directly. She looked at it now. She calculated exactly how much that balance was costing her every month in interest. She saw, for the first time, that she was paying a significant monthly premium simply for the privilege of owing that money. She was motivated. She paid it off within a year, then redirected what had been going to interest payments into savings and, eventually, into simple index fund investments. None of this was dramatic. None of it made a great story to tell at a dinner party. But 10 years after Miriam sat down with that library book, her financial life looked almost unrecognizable compared to where she had started. She had savings. She had investments. She owned a small amount of real estate. She had built a modest side income from a skill she had developed deliberately. Graphic design work she did in evenings and on weekends, which had grown from a hobby into a genuine revenue stream. She was not wealthy by any dramatic measure, but she was financially stable, financially growing, financially free in the sense that mattered most to her. She could make choices based on what she valued rather than what she owed. Miriam's story is not a fairy tale. It is a representative account of how wealth actually gets built for the overwhelming majority of people who build it. Not through a single dramatic event, not through genius or luck or an unfair advantage, through clarity, consistency, patience, and the steady accumulation of hundreds of small, intelligent decisions made over a long period of time. The discipline to keep going when the progress was invisible. The wisdom to stay focused on the horizon when the present felt flat. The third principle is one that most people understand intellectually, but struggle with emotionally, and the gap between intellectual understanding and emotional behavior is where most financial lives are won or lost. The principle is this: emotional discipline with money is one of the most powerful financial advantages a person can possess. We spend a great deal of time in personal finance discussions talking about strategy, which accounts to open, which investments to choose, how to structure a budget, and those things matter. But they are secondary to something more fundamental: whether you can actually follow through on your strategy when your emotions are pulling in the opposite direction. Because your emotions will always pull in the opposite direction. That is not a failure. That is human. The emotional forces that act on financial decisions are not subtle. They are powerful, persistent, and expertly exploited by every marketing machine, social comparison algorithm, and lifestyle media outlet in existence. The desire for status, the fear of missing out, the discomfort of deprivation, the pleasure of immediate reward, the anxiety that drives impulsive financial decisions, the boredom that manufactures reasons to spend. These forces are real, they are constant, and they are working against the patient, disciplined, long-term financial strategy you may be trying to execute. There is a concept in behavioral economics called present bias, which we touched on when discussing long-term thinking, but it deserves more attention here through the lens of emotional discipline. Present bias is the tendency to give dramatically higher weight to immediate costs and rewards than to future ones, even when we consciously know that the future costs and rewards are far more significant. It is why someone can genuinely intend to save money this month and then, standing in a store or browsing online, feel with genuine conviction that this purchase is worth making. The future self who will benefit from saved money feels abstract and distant. The present self who wants the thing is right here, right now, feeling real and urgent. Discipline with money is not about eliminating these feelings. That is neither possible nor desirable. Emotions are not the enemy of good financial decisions. They are simply forces that need to be recognized, understood, and managed rather than blindly obeyed. The financially disciplined person has not removed the desire to spend impulsively. They have developed the habit of pausing between the impulse and the action, long enough for their rational mind to participate in the decision. That pause is everything. Between the impulse and the action, there is a window, sometimes very small, sometimes only a few seconds, in which you can ask a different question. Not, do I want this? But, is this aligned with what I am building? Not, can I afford this? But, is this the best use of this money in the context of where I am trying to go? People who are emotionally disciplined with money have learned to habitually insert that pause. They have trained themselves to recognize the emotional state behind a financial impulse, the boredom, the anxiety, the desire for social approval, the FOMO, and to address the emotional state directly rather than through spending. Not because spending is always wrong, but because spending in response to an emotional trigger is almost never the smartest financial move available. There is almost always a better response to the emotion that does not cost money and does not derail your financial strategy. Lifestyle inflation deserves special attention here. It is one of the most common and most silent wealth destroyers in the lives of people with increasing incomes. The pattern is predictable. Someone gets a raise or a promotion. Their income increases. Almost immediately, their spending increases to match, sometimes exceeds it. The new car to match the new salary. The nicer apartment in the better neighborhood. The more expensive restaurants, the upgraded vacations, the subtle shift in standards across dozens of spending categories. Each individual upgrade feels reasonable. Each one is within the new means. But the cumulative effect is that the gap between income and spending, the gap that actually builds wealth, stays exactly the same, or even shrinks. This is not a moral failure. It is a deeply human response to improved circumstances, and it is powerfully reinforced by social context. When your income rises, and your peer group's lifestyle reflects that new income level, there is enormous social pressure, much of it invisible, much of it operating below the level of conscious awareness. To match that lifestyle, to signal that you belong in this new tier, to avoid the social discomfort of appearing less successful than your income suggests you should be. Resisting lifestyle inflation requires a clear internal value system that is stronger than social comparison. It requires having thought carefully about what you actually want your life to look like, not what other people think it should look like, and being secure enough in that vision to live by it, even when it departs from the visible norm. This is psychologically demanding, but it is one of the most financially consequential habits you can develop. The people who build real, lasting wealth tend to have a persistent gap between what they earn and what they spend. That gap is not created once and maintained automatically. It is defended, consciously and deliberately, against the constant upward pressure of lifestyle inflation. They drive the practical car. They live in the house that is enough, not the house that impresses. They give themselves permission to enjoy money on things that genuinely matter to them, while staying firm against spending that is merely performative. And the gap that this creates, steady, year after year, is where their wealth quietly accumulates. The fourth principle is one that often gets discussed in terms of luck, but which, on closer examination, turns out to be much more about preparation, attention, and a particular quality of mind. The principle is opportunity awareness, the trained ability to recognize when an opportunity for value creation or financial growth is present in your environment. There is a common observation that lucky people seem to create their own luck, that the same individuals keep finding themselves in the right place at the right time, keep stumbling onto the right opportunity, keep benefiting from coincidences that just do not seem to happen as often for other people. And there is genuine research behind this observation. Richard Wiseman, a psychologist at the University of Hertfordshire, spent years studying people who described themselves as lucky versus those who described themselves as unlucky, trying to understand whether the difference was truly random chance or something more controllable. What he found was striking. Lucky people, it turned out, were significantly better at noticing opportunities in their environment. They were more relaxed, more open, more attuned to unexpected possibilities. Unlucky people, by contrast, tended to be tenser, more narrowly focused, more fixated on a specific desired outcome, which meant they often walked past opportunities that were right in front of them because those opportunities did not look exactly like what they were looking for. In other words, what looked like luck from the outside was, to a significant degree, a perceptual skill, the ability to notice what others were missing, to see the signal in the noise, to recognize a pattern or an opening that less attentive observers would simply not register. For wealth building, this principle has profound implications. Opportunities for value creation, for income generation, for investment, for strategic relationship building, these are not nearly as rare as most people believe. They are present, regularly, in the everyday environments of most people's lives. But they are only visible to people who are paying the right kind of attention. What does that attention look like? It starts with curiosity. Genuinely, actively curious people ask more questions than other people. They notice more about how things work, what problems people have, what inefficiencies exist in the systems around them. They read widely across different fields, which gives them a mental library of patterns and models to apply when they encounter new situations. They are interested in the world in a way that is not merely intellectual, but actively searching, always, at some low level of awareness, asking where is the gap? Where is the problem that needs solving? Where is the value waiting to be created? It also requires a certain relationship to comfort. Opportunities often exist at the intersection of discomfort and possibility, in the gaps that nobody has yet filled, because filling them requires doing something unfamiliar, tolerating uncertainty, or investing effort before any reward is guaranteed. People who are highly comfort-seeking tend to stay in their known territory, doing what they already know how to do. This is understandable, but it means systematically avoiding the spaces where most new opportunities live. The financially aware person has learned to read their environment differently. They notice when a problem keeps coming up in conversations with people around them, not just as an inconvenience, but as a potential opportunity. They observe trends in technology, in culture, in demographics, and ask themselves what those trends will require, enable, or displace in the years ahead. They pay attention to what succeeding businesses in their field or adjacent fields are doing, not just to imitate, but to understand the principles behind the success. They are, in a deep sense, students of the world, not only consuming information, but constantly synthesizing it into a picture of where value is flowing and where it might be created. There is also an important relational dimension to opportunity awareness. Many of the best opportunities in life, financial and otherwise, come through people. Through relationships, referrals, conversations, and the organic exchange of information and ideas that happens in a well-tended network. People who build wealth tend to invest genuinely in relationships, not in a transactional, networking, event way, but in the way of actually caring about the people around them, being genuinely useful to them, and building the kind of trust that makes people want to bring you into good things when good things come along. This is not manipulation. It is simply the recognition that human economic life is fundamentally social, that opportunities circulate through networks, and that the size and quality of your network is itself a form of financial asset. Maintaining that asset requires the same kind of consistent, unglamorous work as any other investment. Staying in touch, following through on commitments, adding value before extracting it. Being the kind of person whose calls get returned. Opportunity awareness, then, is not a mystical quality or the domain of the uniquely gifted. It is a practiced orientation of mind, curious, open, attentive, patient, and consistently engaged with the world in a way that allows you to see what others, less deliberately oriented, tend to miss. The fifth principle brings us to something that might seem obvious when stated directly, but is violated with remarkable regularity by people who would very much like to improve their financial lives. The principle is this: continuous financial learning is not a one-time event. It is a permanent habit, and the people who build wealth over time are, almost without exception, the people who never stop learning about money, about markets, about strategy, about the forces that shape the economic world. The knowledge gap in personal finance is staggering. Most people receive essentially no formal financial education growing up. The school system, in most countries, teaches almost nothing about how to manage money, how markets work, what debt really costs, or how compounding operates. This means that the majority of adults are making some of the most consequential decisions of their lives about saving, borrowing, investing, insurance, taxes, with limited or absent knowledge of the principles at stake. And here is the uncomfortable part. Most people are aware of this gap and do relatively little to close it. Not because they do not care. In surveys, financial security consistently ranks among people's highest priorities, but because the discomfort of confronting what you do not know is itself a barrier, because financial topics feel dense and intimidating to people who were never taught a foundation, because the financial industry sometimes benefits from client ignorance and has not always made learning accessible or inviting, and because time feels short and there is always something more immediately pressing to attend to. But people who build wealth find their way past these barriers. They develop the habit of continuous financial learning, reading, listening, asking, studying, that keeps their knowledge growing even as the financial world around them changes. And the return on that learning habit is extraordinary, because financial knowledge, like money itself, compounds. Each thing you learn makes the next thing easier to understand. Each concept absorbed opens doors to the next layer of complexity. Over years and decades, the person who has been consistently educating themselves about money inhabits a fundamentally different intellectual world than the person who stopped learning on graduation day. They make better decisions, spot risks more reliably, identify opportunities more quickly, and execute more effectively on the strategies they choose. What does continuous financial learning look like in practice? It is reading books, not just practical how-to guides but deeper works on economic history, behavioral finance, business strategy, and the biographies of people who have built lasting institutions. It is reading widely enough that you begin to see the patterns that run across different domains, the recurring principles that explain why some financial approaches work and others fail regardless of the specific context. It is also developing the habit of learning from experience, your own and others. The financially self-educating person treats every financial decision, including the bad ones, as a data point. When a strategy works, they try to understand why, precisely enough that they can apply the principle again when something fails. An investment that underperforms, a business decision that backfires, a financial choice that looks worse in retrospect. They do not simply wince and move on. They study it. They ask hard questions. What did I miss? What assumption turned out to be wrong? What would I need to know next time to make a better decision? This is the difference between having 20 years of experience and having 1 year of experience 20 times. Experience, by itself, does not automatically produce wisdom. It is the combination of experience and deliberate reflection, the willingness to extract lessons from what has happened, to update your mental models in response to new evidence, that produces genuine financial wisdom over time. Mentors and teachers also deserve mention here. One of the most efficient paths to financial knowledge is learning from people who have already navigated the territory you are trying to traverse, not celebrity gurus on social media with generic advice designed to attract the largest possible audience, but real people in your world, or accessible through their writing, their interviews, their case studies, who have built something you respect and who can offer genuine insight into how they did it. The willingness to seek out such people, to ask genuine questions, to be a humble and attentive student, is itself a form of financial intelligence that many people talk about, but fewer practice consistently. The larger message here is that your financial education is your responsibility, not the school systems, not the government's, not your employer's, yours. And the moment you accept that responsibility fully, the moment you stop waiting for someone to teach you and start actively seeking the knowledge you need, your financial trajectory begins to shift in ways that are quiet at first but cumulative and, over time, transformative. The sixth principle moves us into territory that distinguishes people who are financially comfortable from people who have built genuinely significant wealth. It is the principle of systems thinking, the orientation toward building structures, processes, and arrangements that generate results repeatedly, without requiring your constant personal effort at every step. There is a useful distinction here between income that requires your continuous presence, what is often called active income, and income that flows from a system you have built, what is often called passive income, though that term is somewhat misleading because building effective systems is anything but passive. It requires substantial upfront investment of time, energy, attention, and often money. But once built, a good system produces output that is not directly proportional to the hours you put in. It scales. This is the fundamental logic behind every business that grows beyond a single person's capacity. A skilled craftsman can produce only as much as their own 2 hands and 40 waking hours per week allow. But a business that systematizes the craft, that trains others, creates repeatable processes, builds a brand, develops a distribution channel, can produce orders of magnitude more output without any individual working proportionally more hours. The system does what the individual cannot. People who think in systems are always asking a slightly different question than people who are focused purely on immediate output. They are not just asking, "How do I get this result?" They are asking, "How do I build something that gets this result reliably, over and over, without my having to restart from scratch every time?" This can apply across many different domains of financial life. An investor who builds a portfolio with a clear allocation strategy and automatic contributions is building a system. The money flows in, distributes according to the strategy, and compounds over time without requiring constant active management. A business owner who builds documented processes, trains reliable staff, and creates systems for customer acquisition and service delivery has built something that generates value without depending entirely on their own daily heroics. A writer who builds an audience is creating a system, because the next piece of work they produce is met by an existing, waiting readership, rather than having to find its audience from zero. Systems thinking also connects to the concept of leverage. In physics, a lever allows a small force to move a much larger object by positioning the force advantageously. In financial life, leverage is anything that allows your effort, your money, or your ideas to produce more output than they could without the lever. Learning a skill that makes you dramatically more productive is leverage. Building a network that amplifies your opportunities is leverage. Investing in assets that generate returns on your capital is leverage. Creating a business that other people help run is leverage. The wealthy, systems-oriented thinker is always looking for leverage, not in a manipulative or exploitative sense, but in the engineering sense. Always asking, where can I position my effort to get the greatest return? Where can I build something that multiplies rather than merely adds? One of the most powerful systems that exists for individual wealth building is the simple, automated investment plan. It sounds almost insultingly basic. Every month, automatically, a set portion of your income moves from your bank account into an investment account and deploys into a diversified portfolio. You do not make a decision each month about whether to do it. You do not evaluate whether the market looks favorable right now. You have built a system, and the system executes on your behalf, month after month, compounding quietly in the background of your life. The reason this simple system is so powerful is that it removes the most common barriers to consistent investing. It removes the decision fatigue that causes people to indefinitely delay taking action. It removes the emotional reactivity that causes people to stop investing when markets look scary. It removes the friction that allows inertia to win. The system handles all of that. All you have to do is build it and leave it alone. This, ultimately, is the gift of systems thinking. It removes your worst self from the equation, the self that is tired, distracted, emotionally reactive, present-biased, and subject to the 1,000 small impulses that disrupt long-term plans. A well-built financial system runs whether or not your best self shows up that day. It does not need your enthusiasm. It does not need your perfect judgment. It simply needs to be built, once, carefully, and then maintained with a steady hand. The seventh principle is perhaps the most counterintuitive in a culture that rewards speed and celebrates disruption. It is patience. The willingness to stay the course through the long, flat middle of any wealth-building journey, when the results are not yet visible, when the strategy has not yet demonstrated its payoff, when doubt is easy and discipline is hard, because wealth, in the overwhelming majority of cases, does not build in a straight line. It builds in a curve, slowly at first, then accelerating, then dramatically. And most people who fail at wealth building fail not because their strategy was wrong, but because they abandoned it before the curve bent upward. The mathematics of compounding are worth returning to here, because understanding them on an emotional level, not just an intellectual one, is one of the most financially transformative things a person can do. Compounding describes what happens when you earn a return, not just on your original investment, but on all the accumulated returns of every previous period. It is growth that feeds on itself, and its character is deeply unintuitive to human psychology. In the early years of a compounding investment, the growth is modest. Even in percentage terms, that would be considered excellent. The absolute dollar amounts in the beginning can feel almost insultingly small. Someone who has been diligently saving and investing for 5 years looks at their account and sees a balance that, while larger than when they started, does not feel like a life-changing amount of money. It does not feel like it was worth 5 years of discipline and sacrifice. This is the moment where many people give up, or worse, where they raid the account for some present, tense desire, permanently disrupting the compounding process. What they do not see, because it has not happened yet, is what those 5 years of accumulated savings will do over the next 20 years, and what those 25 years will do over the 30 years after that. The curve does not look impressive in its early stages, but it becomes extraordinary in its later ones, and the critical truth is that the extraordinary later stages are entirely dependent on having patiently endured the unimpressive early ones. You cannot skip ahead. You cannot have the late stage compounding without having survived the early stage patience test. This is why so many financial advisors emphasize starting early with whatever amount you have available, rather than waiting until you have a larger amount to invest. Every month of delay is not a month of missed growth. It is a month that the entire future of that investment is pushed later into your life, when time to compound is shorter. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today, and the worst possible response to not having planted 20 years ago is to let that regret become a reason not to plant today. Patience in wealth building also requires a particular relationship to short-term volatility. Markets go up and markets go down. Economic cycles ebb and flow. Specific investments sometimes lose value over periods that feel very long when you are living through them. For someone who lacks patience, who is watching their portfolio with daily anxiety and evaluating every dip as a potential catastrophe, this volatility is psychologically unbearable. It generates fear responses, and fear responses generate bad decisions, selling when prices are low, abandoning strategies that were sound, moving money to where it feels safer at exactly the moment when safer means lower returning. Patient investors understand something that anxious investors do not, or rather, feel something that anxious investors cannot. They understand that volatility is not the same as loss, that a drop in market value is not a realized loss until you sell, that the same patience that allowed the compounding to build the account in the first place is the same patience that allows you to hold through a downturn and participate in the recovery, that, historically, has always followed. The mentally mature investor has what might be called a long-time horizon, not just in the sense that they are planning for 30 years, but in the sense that they evaluate their progress on a timeline that is commensurate with the actual timeline of wealth building. They do not judge their financial strategy by this week's performance or even this year's. They are playing a very different game than the anxious, short-term, focused investor, and they are playing it on a field where patience, over time, is the single most reliable edge. There is a man named Elias, not a famous person, not someone whose name you would find in any book about wealth or success. Just a man in his early 40s, who works as a mid-level project manager at a logistics company, who lives in a modest neighborhood, who drives a 10-year-old sedan that runs well and does not impress anyone, and who recently looked at his financial situation and realized that something had quietly, fundamentally shifted. Elias grew up with a complicated relationship to money. His father had been, by any measure, a financial wreck, brilliant in many ways, genuinely charismatic, full of big ideas that never quite materialized, and chronically unable to hold on to the money that occasionally came his way. The family's financial life was a cycle of brief abundance and longer scarcity, punctuated by arguments and anxiety that Elias absorbed deeply as a child without knowing what to do with it. As a young adult, Elias had replicated many of his father's patterns without recognizing them as patterns. He was good at his job and earned a reasonable salary. But money came in and money went out, and there was never much left at the end. He had a vague sense of unease about his finances that he managed largely by not thinking about it too directly. The unease was always there, in the background, like a low hum that he had learned to tune out. The shift came for Elias through a conversation. A colleague of his, a woman named Sandra, who was in the same salary band, who drove a similarly unremarkable car, who seemed to have a life not dramatically different from Elias's on the surface, mentioned almost in passing, during a work lunch, that she was thinking about retiring in 15 years. Elias had not thought about retirement as something in his 15-year range. He thought about it as something that happened to older people eventually. The idea that it was a specific plan, with a specific timeline already in progress, that stopped him. He asked Sandra what she meant, and Sandra, in the matter of fact way of someone who has simply been quietly doing the work for years, told him about the investment accounts she had been contributing to since her late 20s, about the index funds she had chosen based on several months of research a long time ago, and which she had barely touched since, about the small rental property she had bought carefully 8 years ago that was now generating meaningful monthly income. She was not showing off. She was just describing her life. Elias went home that evening and, for the first time in his adult life, looked honestly at his financial situation, not glancingly. Not the way you quickly scan a bank balance and then look away, really looked. He added up what he had, what he owed, what he was spending and on what, and what it all meant in terms of where he would be in 15 years if nothing changed. The picture was not catastrophic. He was not in crisis, but it was not what he wanted. He had been earning a good income for 15 years and had essentially nothing to show for it beyond a paid-down car and a modest savings account that he raided periodically for things that he could no longer quite remember. The insight that changed everything for Elias was not a strategic insight. It was a psychological one. He realized sitting at his kitchen table that evening, that he had been treating his financial situation as something that was happening to him, rather than something he was directing. He had been passive in a domain where passivity was incredibly expensive. Every year of financial drift was a year of compound growth forfeited. Every impulsive purchase was not just money spent. It was money that would not be there, compounding, in 15 years. He had been, without realizing it, making 1,000 small financial decisions every month, all of them shaped by impulse and inertia rather than intention. And the cumulative cost of those decisions was a financial life that was much less than it should have been. He did not overhaul everything at once. He did not need to. He started with one account, a retirement investment account that he set up and automated the same week, a manageable monthly contribution that he honestly would not miss. Then, 2 months later, he started a separate investment account for longer-term goals. Then, he paid off the small credit card balance he had been carrying. Each step was small. Each step was intentional. Each step was the result of a simple new habit. Before spending money on anything beyond essentials, asking whether this was the best use of this money in the context of where he was trying to go. The most important change in Elias's life was not financial. It was the sense of agency. The experience of waking up every morning, knowing that his financial life was being shaped by his choices, not by inertia and circumstance, that he was building something, however slowly, that 15 years from now, the picture would look different. Not because of luck, not because of a windfall, but because of decisions he was making now, consistently, with intention and clarity. That sense of agency is not a minor thing. It is, for many people, the psychological turning point that makes everything else possible. The moment when you stop feeling like money is something that happens to you, and start feeling like money is something you are responsible for directing. That shift in feeling is the beginning of wealth building, not the account balance, not the investment strategy. The shift in how you relate to the whole enterprise. We come now, after this long and careful exploration of principles, habits, and stories, to the place where everything we have discussed converges into something larger than any individual concept. A question that is worth asking not once but regularly, as a kind of ongoing calibration for your financial and personal life. What kind of relationship do you want to have with money? Not how much do you want, but how do you want to think about it? How do you want it to function in your life? What role do you want it to play? Because here is something that all of the principles we have explored point toward. Whether we have named it explicitly or not, money is a tool, a powerful tool, a tool that can create security and freedom and opportunity, but a tool nonetheless. Not a scoreboard, not a measure of human worth, not the primary metric of a life well lived. People who are psychologically confused about what money is, who treat it as a substitute for security, or an antidote to existential anxiety, or proof of their value as a human being, tend to have complicated, often self-destructive financial lives, regardless of how much they earn. They accumulate without satisfaction. They compare without contentment. They spend in pursuit of feelings that money cannot actually produce. And the more money they get, the more the psychological dysfunction scales with it. People who understand money clearly, who see it as a resource to be managed wisely in service of a life they have actually chosen, tend to have much healthier financial lives, not because they are better at math or have superior investment knowledge, though those things help, but because their emotional relationship to money is one of clarity and instrumentality rather than confusion and compulsion. They are using money rather than being used by it. The wealth-building mindset, at its deepest level, is not about accumulation. It is about freedom. It is about having enough security, enough options, enough flexibility, that your life is shaped more by your values and choices than by financial necessity and constraint. That is a form of wealth that matters in ways that a number on a spreadsheet cannot fully capture. Building toward that freedom requires everything we have discussed. The long-term thinking that keeps you focused on the horizon when the present is loud. The commitment to value creation that ensures your financial growth is connected to genuine contribution rather than mere accumulation. The emotional discipline that keeps your strategy intact when your impulses are pushing in the opposite direction. The opportunity awareness that keeps you alert and engaged with the world around you. The continuous learning that keeps your knowledge growing and your models adapting. The systems thinking that allows your effort and money to work harder than any individual could alone. And the patience, the deep, practiced, almost meditative patience that allows you to stay in the game long enough for compounding to work its slow, extraordinary magic. None of this is easy. Anyone who tells you that building wealth is simple, or that the psychology is minor compared to the strategy, has not looked honestly at how many people have excellent strategies and no follow-through. The psychology is not peripheral to wealth building. It is central. The strategy matters, but the mind that executes the strategy, or fails to, matters more. What I want you to carry from this exploration is not a checklist, not a 10-step program, not a promise of what you will have if you follow the right sequence of instructions. What I want you to carry is a different quality of attention toward money, toward time, toward opportunity, and toward yourself as a person who is capable of making genuinely good decisions over the long arc of a financial life. You are not fixed. The patterns you have inherited from your upbringing, the habits you have accumulated without examining them, the beliefs about money that operate below the level of conscious awareness. None of these are permanent. They are learned. And what is learned can be unlearned and replaced with something more useful. The moment you begin thinking differently about money, when you shift from passive to active, from short-term to long-term, from reactive to intentional, the path begins to change, not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently, and consistently, over time, is how everything important gets built. The greatest financial decision you will ever make is not about any specific investment or purchase or business choice. It is the decision to take your financial life seriously, to see it as a domain that deserves the same quality of thought, attention, and commitment that you would bring to anything else you care deeply about. To stop treating it as something that will sort itself out eventually, and start treating it as something you are actively, deliberately, intelligently building, one small decision at a time, day after day, year after year, in the direction of a future you have actually chosen. Wealth, in the end, is not a destination. It is not a number at which you will finally feel enough. It is a direction, a practice, a way of moving through the world with clarity, discipline, intention, and patience. It is the habit of planting trees you may not sit under for a decade. It is the discipline of delaying pleasure today so that tomorrow's choices are made from strength rather than necessity. It is the wisdom to create value for others and to recognize that in doing so, you create something of lasting value for yourself. The mind that builds wealth is not a special mind. It is not a rare mind. It is a trained mind, trained through reading, through reflection, through the practice of small decisions made well, repeated often enough to become habit, practiced long enough to become character. That training is available to anyone who chooses to begin it, and the beginning, the real beginning, is not a new account or a new budget or a new investment. The beginning is a decision, the decision to think differently, to see money not as something that happens to you, but as something you direct, not as an end in itself, but as a means toward a life that is genuinely, authentically, deeply yours. That decision, made fully and honestly, is the seed of everything that follows. Plant it well, tend it patiently, and give it the time it needs to become what it is capable of becoming. This is the quiet, unhurried, undramatic truth about how wealth gets built. And now, having heard it, you know where to begin.